Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. In today's question, we're going to take a deeper look at one of the new mechanics in Adventures of Forgotten Realms. That's right, we're going to be venturing into the dungeon. So, what does venture into the dungeon actually mean? Well, if you see this instruction on a card, there's two possible things you could do to fulfill it. If you are not already in a dungeon, then what you would do is take one of the dungeons, any of the three, your choice, and put it into the command zone. Then put a marker on the first room. Anytime you put a marker on any of the rooms, the ability associated with that room will trigger. These are triggered abilities, and so you can interact with them in any of the ways that you could interact with normal triggered abilities. So, if you already are in a dungeon, then what you would do is move your marker from one room, the room that you're in, to the next room. If there's a choice, then you could pick either one of them. But you can only move down. You can't move backwards, and you can't move from side to side through the walls. It's pretty self-explanatory, and once you go through it a few times, I'm sure it'll make a lot of sense. Now, when you get to the very last room, its triggered ability is going to trigger and go on the stack. Anytime it leaves the stack, whether it's because it resolved or because it got countered or something else wacky happened, anytime it leaves the stack, that means that you are considered to have completed that dungeon. And the dungeon will get removed from the game as a state-based action. If you're instructed to venture into the dungeon again, then you'll pick again, one of the three dungeons. It doesn't matter if you've already completed it or not, it's still your choice. Another cool thing about dungeons is that you always have access to all three of them. It doesn't matter if you've completed one before, you can do the same one again as many times as you want. It doesn't even matter if you don't have or even own the card associated with the dungeon that you want to go into. Just like tokens, you are considered to always have access to all of the dungeons that there are, even if you are in a limited tournament and you haven't drafted or gotten any of them in your sealed pool. Another format-specific thing that I'm sure will come up is in Two-Headed Giant. Each player on a team has their own dungeon. The two people on each side of the Two-Headed Giant could be in two different dungeons or in different rooms of the same dungeon, or one of them be in a dungeon and the other not. It's not really clear how that would happen, but hey, these effects are magical after all. Another kind of interesting thing that can happen is there's a few different ways to venture into the dungeon at instant speed. If one of these happens, then it might be possible to respond to one of the trigger abilities from one of the dungeon rooms and advance into the next dungeon room and have that triggered ability trigger and resolve before the triggered ability from the previous room. That's absolutely fine and there's nothing wrong with that. It's even possible to respond to the triggered ability from the very last dungeon room and venture into a new dungeon or even the same dungeon and have the triggered ability from the first room of that dungeon go on the stack and resolve ahead of the last triggered ability from the dungeon that you just exited. Pretty interesting. There are a few cards in the set that care about completing a dungeon. What that means is you just have the triggered ability from the last room of the dungeon leave the stack. It doesn't have to resolve, of course that's preferable, but it just has to leave the stack in order for you to be considered to have completed that dungeon. And it doesn't matter if the card that's in question has actually seen you complete it or not. It's sort of like there's a little switch in the game. Anytime that triggered ability leaves the stack from the last room, well, that means you completed a dungeon and that switch gets flipped on. It's not really possible to uncomplete a dungeon, so there's not really a way for that switch to get flipped off ever. Any subsequent cards that you play that care about having completed a dungeon will see that you have. Finally, a couple of practical notes about playing dungeon cards in paper Magic tournaments. These cards do not take up a spot in your sideboard, so there's absolutely no downside to taking a set of them to any tournament that you want. They don't count as regular Magic cards, so that means there would not be a deck or deck list problem if a judge were to find them in your deck box or with your sideboard during a deck check. You even could bring them along, even if you have no way to enter the dungeon yourself, just to try to psych out a future opponent. In fact, if your opponent tries to venture into a dungeon that they don't happen to have access to, and you don't mind sharing a little bit, well, you could really be a hero. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again tomorrow for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.